Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jimmy Choi, and I was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease back in 2003 at the age of 27. I am a member of the Michael J. Fox Foundation's Patient Council. I am a Team Fox member, and I am an athlete and an advocate for people with Parkinson's. I'm excited to be here with you today and also with our panelists. Now, today we're going to be talking about medication for Parkinson's disease. Now, I personally have been on medication for almost all of my 21 years living with Parkinson's. And I have to say that my experience with it will likely be different than yours, with the exception that we will all have our own ups and downs when it comes to taking, adjusting, and fine-tuning a schedule that will work for you and me. Medication discussion is not just limited to pills, as we will also talk about various different therapies as well that will help treat some of our symptoms and hopefully help us feel our best. We will be discussing all kinds of medications that are available, how to work with your doctors to find your best routine, and what new and emerging treatments are in the pipeline, including one that was just approved last week. One important note is that currently all of the available Parkinson's medications treat and mask various symptoms. Fortunately, none of the ones that are approved yet will slow or stop disease progression. Well, arguably there's one, but it's not medication, that's exercise. But at the same time, though, many trials are currently in the pipeline that are now testing therapies with the potential to slow or stop progression. So that's the good news. But before we get started with our main discussion, here are some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions at all, please type it in the Q&A box near the middle of your screen. Foundation staff and our panelists and myself will get to as many of those as we can throughout this entire webinar. There isn't a general chat, so your questions will not appear for everyone else to see. And if you are looking for other helpful information, please don't forget to check out the resource list on your screen. To add captions in English, please click the CC button on the bottom right of your media player on your screen. And finally, like all webinars, this session will be recorded and available to watch on demand. The on-demand version has captions available, and it will be also available in a few different languages. Now, we've got a lot to discuss, so let's get started. I want to first introduce our panelists. First, let's welcome Ali Signorelli. She's a nonprofit fundraiser and event producer who was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's in 2022 at the age of 47. She's an advocate, she's a writer and fellow member of the Michael J. Fox Foundation Patient Council. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, Jimmy, thanks.
And next we have Dr. Eric Jakowiak, who is a movement disorder specialist and an assistant professor of neurology at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He was also a class of 2020 fellow of the Edmund J. Safra Fellowship in Movement Disorders, a partnership between the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the Edmund J. Safra Foundation to help increase and build a network of movement disorder clinicians across the globe. And finally, let's welcome Brian Fisk. Brian is the Michael J. Fox Foundation's chief scientist and works with a team of people across the foundation and in the Parkinson's community to develop its vision for accelerating research and drug development. He's also an active Team Fox member, a researcher raising funds supporting research. How awesome is that? Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Now, the real question is, how do we determine that what's the best Parkinson's medicine regimen for you or for people who are on this webinar right now? And how do we continuously adjust to the various changes no matter where you are in your Parkinson's journey? It's worthy to note that because this disease is so individual, what works best is going to be different for just about everybody. We're going to start with Dr. Jakowiak. Many of our audience members are going to be newly diagnosed. Can we first describe and tell everybody what exactly is a movement disorder specialist and how our MDS is different than a neurologist?
Yeah, so movement disorder specialists are all neurologists. So we've all done our general broad training in neurology. And then we've decided to spend a little bit extra time training specifically in Parkinson's disease and other neurological disorders that affect movement.
Thank you. And now that we have defined a movement disorder specialist or an MDS, let's start very broadly and work our way down. What are the general kinds of treatments that are available to treat Parkinson's symptoms today?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, always want to mention the non-medication treatments like exercise, because these are going to be essential for everyone. But then when we start to talk about medications and treatments, most of the medicines out there are really geared at increasing or preserving the amount of dopamine that's in the brain. So in Parkinson's disease, one of the main problems is that there's just not enough of this chemical called dopamine in the brain. So we either supplement that and give more, reduce how much dopamine is being broken down by certain enzymes in the brain, or can give chemicals or medications to mimic that effect.
Thank you. Brian, we've all heard, right now, every time we talk about medication, that the gold standard since the 1960s has been carbidopa-levodopa. What do we know about how levodopa works?
Yeah, no, it's, we were just hearing, I think dopamine has been such a central part of how we think about Parkinson's disease. So obviously we know that cells that produce dopamine in the brain are some of the primary cells that are lost in the disease. And so this idea of replacing it with medication has been a powerful, approach over the years. And levodopa really was one of the first, I think, treatments really to do that. And levodopa basically acts like a precursor to dopamine. So it gets taken up by those brain cells, and it's converted, with a sort of mix of different enzymes, converted into dopamine so that the cells can actually release that in the brain and act on the parts of the brain that are involved in movement control and other aspects of brain function as well. But that's that movement control that is most prominent in Parkinson's disease. So as we were just hearing, levodopa is one way that we can do that, giving you essentially sort of a precursor to the dopamine that your cells can take up, or other ways we can, address that. There's some drugs that will target, we just heard, the metabolism of dopamine itself, the idea that if we can kind of block its breakdown, we can kind of keep more dopamine around in the brain, keep those levels a little bit higher. Other drugs that can actually target and kind of mimic the effects of dopamine. So there's a whole range of these sort of dopamine-centered medications that are available to people today.
Now, you mentioned these various different types of dopamine preservation, dopamine production. And so I just wanted to make sure that the audience understand that, when we talk about things like dopamine agonists and dopamine, those are the various different classes that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can either sort of give you some additional dopamine, through something like levodopa, or we can mimic the effects of dopamine by giving you what's called a dopamine agonist, which sort of like is a chemical that sort of looks like dopamine and can bind to the same sort of brain receptors that normally bind to dopamine. So that's a dopamine agonist. We can inhibit the enzyme that normally metabolizes dopamine. You may have heard of these called MAOB inhibitors, is the fancy word for it. These are, basically enzymes that break down dopamine. If we can inhibit those, we can kind of keep more of the dopamine around in the system. So a lot of different ways that people have looked at essentially the dopamine problem in Parkinson's to figure out different ways that we could address that.
Great. Thank you for that. I think that was important just because, there are just so many different ways, and I want to make sure that our audience understands, the various different classes of dopamine production, maintenance, or mimic, as you mentioned. But so thank you. Now, Allie, you were diagnosed in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share with us and the audience your early medication experience?
Yeah, I had actually been having symptoms at that point for 4 years. So I was very anxious to get some relief. And I, like many newly diagnosed people, had a million questions. I went to the internet before my first official MDS appointment to sort of do my due diligence, and found the most radically disparate opinions on when to start, what to take, when, not to do, what not to take, what to be afraid of. There were lots of horror stories about side effects, and there almost felt like there was a competition or a will of strength if you could hold off on taking medicine for as long as possible. And so I sort of bought into all of that. My first MDS was very receptive to what my husband and I wanted to do. I had no idea what that meant. So we took a very conservative approach. We started with an agonist. It had very little effect on my symptoms at that point. And I ended up switching MDSs, and he had a completely different approach, which was to say, you're in your 40s, you're working, you're a mom, you want to have as much symptom relief right now as you possibly can while you're still active. We'll worry about whether it wears off or the disease out progresses it a little bit later on. So started on levodopa shortly after that. I think it was about 5 months after I was officially diagnosed. And it was a game changer for me. I luckily do not have a lot of symptoms. I have orthostatic hypotension from it, but levodopa has been life-changing for me because I am able to function almost all of the days without too much symptoms, which for me is tremor. I have tremor up and down my right side significantly. So.
Well, thanks for sharing that. For me, it's a little bit different. Back then when I was diagnosed 21 years ago, luckily I didn't have Dr. Google to scare the crap out of me. I did have Ask Jeeves though back then.
Yes.
And I did ask Jeeves and there was very limited information back then. So luckily for me, but I was diagnosed using the carbidopa-levodopa method, which means, okay, we suspect you have Parkinson's. Take this medication. If you feel better, you have it, right? So that was how I was diagnosed. So I started on medications almost immediately because it did make me feel better, and I just didn't want to go back to how I was feeling before. But my movement disorder specialist back then switched me almost like after we confirmed the diagnosis. She switched me to a dopamine agonist, which back then I thought I should just do as the doctor tells me. But we're going to learn more about this as we talk about it. It took me 8 years to realize that, it's more than just do what your doctor tells you. Now, on that note, Dr. Jacobiak, now, how do the doctors determine like when is the right medication for an individual?
Yeah, and I appreciate the both of you sharing your experiences. And I think as a historical note, it's important to understand that our understanding and the practice of medicine has morphed over the years too. So we do have a better understanding now about how each of these medicines work and kind of long-term effects and side effects. So with time, with collective experience, and with actually a number of studies and research trials have come out, that when we talk about first starting a medicine, current practice, that the large majority of people, that is going to be carbidopa-levodopa over the other medications. That is still a conversation to have with your specialist. Certainly, there may be some things or individual decisions that might push you or your doctor one way or the other. But most of the time, carbidopa-levodopa is going to be the most effective and really oftentimes the best tolerated medication to start with.
No, so that's one of the most effective medications that you mentioned we should start with. Now, many people are always wondering about the timing of it all, right? Personally for me, I didn't know better. I started taking it just to take it. So what do you think people should think about as they're trying to decide whether or not they should start medication?
Yeah, so I think it's you can agonize over the decision and think about pros and cons, but to me, I try to boil it down to a very simple question, and that is, are the motor symptoms that you're having, be it slowness, stiffness, rigidity, tremor, are they bothersome enough to you? Or are they limiting enough in your everyday life that you would like them to be better or lessened? And if they are, then I would say it's time to consider medication. Just kind of simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's a very smart and simple advice. Before we move on, Dr. can you help us define for the audience exactly what is on time and off time mean? Because we're going to get into this discussion real quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So think about off time being your motor symptoms of Parkinson's. That's slower movement, maybe trouble walking, trouble with fine motor skills, dexterity, tremor, stiffness. Anytime you're experiencing those, consider that off time. And then on would be the improvement that you get from medication. So when those things improve and you're feeling better. So when the medicines kick in and you feel good and they're working, it's on, it's working. And then when they wear off or they're not working and you're feeling all those symptoms, that's what we call off time.
Now, Ali, I'm going to turn to you. Oftentimes patients have a different definition or a slightly different definition of what on and off time means to them. Would you care to share what?
Yeah. I mean, simply put, yes, I agree. I think there's gray area in all of that where it's sort of like levels of on and levels of off. When I'm truly, truly off, which for me rarely, if ever happens, if I miss a dose or just something going on in my life that really exacerbates the symptoms. When I'm truly off, I'm almost incapacitated. So I very carefully, monitor, as most patients do, when and how much. And I try very hard never to be fully off. But having said that, over the course of the last, I would say 13 months, when I first started levodopa, I had no off symptoms. I had no off time. I was managing it so well and on time that I never really felt the full effect of the symptoms come back. As the disease progresses over this year, it slowly is starting to come back where, the medicine does not last as long as it used to, or I get to that off period. But at this point, anyway, I'm not really in the full off. I'm sort of in the just dimmed set, if you put it in that context. So yeah, I think it's a gray area for all of us. And it also depends, Jimmy, and I know we're going to talk about this, but it also depends on what else I'm doing besides just the medicine. If I'm actively working out, taking care of myself, sleeping well, all of that really contributes to it too. So
yeah, no, absolutely, that's a good point, and we will get into that now. But you brought up a good point. I'm going to go back to Dr. Jacobiak. Is that Ali mentioned that when she first started, there was no off times, and I experienced the same thing. When I first started, there was very little off times, and now, I call what I have a window of movement in each given day. And in that window of movement, I try to get all my important things done, because the rest of the day I'm going to be wrecked or I'm just not going to be moving as well. Is that a characteristic of levodopa seemingly like it's becoming less effective over time? Can you talk about that? Because that seems to be a lot of questions people are thinking about. Does it become less effective over time?
Yeah. So excellent question. So most of the time, earlier on in the disease course, people don't tend to feel those ups and downs quite as much. And to Ali's point, definitely, yes, there are degrees of on or degrees of off. There's a gray zone in there, and you might have some ups and downs, but really the kind of more dramatic swings tend to occur later in the disease or just as the disease progresses. And so I wouldn't necessarily think about this as a failure of the medication, but more of just a natural and expected course of the process here. And so, we can think about, Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease, meaning that it is continuously getting worse in the background, even if your symptoms are being treated and well controlled. So when we go back to the, talking about dopamine, as your brain is losing more dopamine as the disease progresses, naturally it's going to need more or more frequent doses, or we might have to just, do more to treat it. And that's expected, but I wouldn't think about it as a failure of the medication or the medication not working anymore.
Yeah. And so I also wanted, because I get asked this question a ton. So I want to thank you for providing your response to that. But now I'm going to ask Brian from a research side of things, right? What does the research and the data say about whether or not medication is less effective over time? And also, because that seems to be one of the reasons why people are waiting to start the medication until later, right? So what's the research saying about starting medication earlier versus later and how it works over time?
Yeah, no, this is an important question. I think one that's sort of existed, really since, dopamine medications were, really being delivered for Parkinson's disease. So there have been a number of interesting studies over the years, that have tried to look at this question of whether, starting, something like levodopa early in your disease, journey versus kind of delaying and waiting, whether that offers any particular benefit or not. And there was some early data actually in the early 2000s that suggested that maybe even starting levodopa early could slow your disease down. And so there was a lot of interest in this question. Probably the most recent data that has come out was, from a trial. There was an initial trial done in the sort of the mid, 20-teens that looked at this question of whether starting levodopa early in your disease. So if you're newly diagnosed, sort of starting levodopa relatively early versus waiting, a year or so to begin using it. Specifically then with this idea of like looking then about a year or two later and asking, okay, do you see major differences in these two groups of people, one starting early versus late? And they frankly didn't find anything. It didn't seem to slow the disease down. The people that when they checked in the follow-up, both groups looked essentially the same. So there wasn't really any clear benefit on disease slowing or even some of these, additional complications that arose when they looked at those two groups. That study, they've actually done a sort of a follow-up to that. Just recently published a 3 and a 5 year follow-up in that same group of people. And again, see the same effect. So what it really tells us is there's probably not a lot of particular, at least data-driven evidence that suggests starting early versus late is going to give you some sort of advantage or benefit. So it's really, I think, comes down to just a personal choice with you and your doctor. And I think, what Eric said before, this really comes down to when your symptoms are impacting your functional day of, daily living and life and ability to work. And, often people who are newly diagnosed maybe are still working. And if it's really impacting your ability to do the things that you want to do, have that conversation then with your doctor about whether it's the right time to start these medications.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think quality of life, right, is what we're all aiming for.
Exactly.
So real quickly, there's one thing that another subject that comes up a lot is, if I start medication now, I'm not going to be able to participate in clinical trials and things like that. From a scientific perspective, what are your thoughts on that in terms of eligibility for studies?
No, this is a good one too. And I know, for many, clinical trials and clinical research is such an important part, I think, for many reasons. Obviously, for people living with the disease, it's an opportunity to get access maybe to early investigational treatments. And certainly for the research field, it is our one and only best way to test whether these treatments offer benefit. So I think it's important when thinking about this, to remember that clinical trials are, at the end of the day, these are experiments. These are clinical experiments. Researchers are asking a hypothesis. Does this drug in this group of people potentially offer benefits or not? And they're designing these trials specifically to test that hypothesis. And so I think, very often, depending on, again, the particular question the researchers are asking, it's important that they define the group they want to test it in. And so sometimes that might be, we only want people who have not yet gone on dopamine medication. So for example, that study I just mentioned about whether starting levodopa early or not, people who had already been on any type of dopamine medication were excluded from that trial because the specific question they were asking was, does early versus later start of levodopa, matter when it comes to your disease progression? So it would not have made sense for them to include people who are already on medication in that particular study. In other cases, and I know we'll talk about maybe some other symptom treatments later today, you might want people who are currently on medication because you're actually looking for either the effects of, another type of treatment on those treatments, or you're trying to optimize, the on time, or the, reduce the off time, things like that. So there are trials where they're specifically then looking for people who are on medication or certain kinds of medication. So really, it's important as we sort of think about what trials are, is they really are experiments, and that's why they're so, tend to be, have such specific inclusion and exclusion criteria, as they say. So, but when again comes to individuals interested in getting clinical research, and I assume Eric would agree with this, we would never want someone to delay the benefits of being on a drug if it's helping their daily function and their daily quality of life, out of some sense that in the future they may be eligible for a certain type of trial. Because I think that would, trying to balance those two, I think would be ultimately detrimental to the individual living with Parkinson's, and we would never want to see that and see people making that kind of decision.
Yeah, and when I started, I was signing up for all the clinical trials that I can possibly sign up for, and then when I started later on as I progressed, I started being denied for a lot of these trials. And I just want to remind everybody that there is probably a trial out there for anyone in various different stages of their lives living with Parkinson. Taking medication does not prevent you from volunteering for research, right? And of course, not taking medication doesn't prevent you from volunteering as well. But for those of you who are not yet on medication yet, and can, especially, you guys can make some valuable contributions to the study on how disease changes over time, as Brian mentioned, and with those early or late starting medication studies, but also a study like the Foundation's landmark research study, the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, also known as PPMI. This study is currently actively recruiting people of all backgrounds. And to learn more about this, you guys can email joinppmi@michaeljfox.org, or if you want to give us a call, it's 877-525-PPMI. Now, we can talk about a lot of these subjects all over, but I want to move on to another big question that I'm sure, Ali, you and I get a lot, is, how do we know it's time? We've been on this same medication for years and years, or I have been on this medication for years. You have been on the same medication for months. How do we know when it's time to change? So Dr. Bartkowiak, how do you determine when it might be time for one of your patients to actually switch meds, like maybe from dopamine production to from dopamine preservation to dopamine production, for example?
Yeah. So I think anytime I talk to a patient, I usually start with an open-ended question of just, how are things going? How are you doing? And if the answer I get back is, well, I wish I could be doing this, or, the medicine doesn't seem to be working quite as well as what it used to, or it's wearing off in between doses, then I kind of use that initial response to kind of start, getting more details and trying to figure out, well, okay, what's your day like? How are the symptoms limiting you? Is it a timing thing where it's wearing off, or is it just that the magnitude of the effect isn't as good? And yeah, if there's ways to improve symptoms, then I would say it's time to start adjusting medications. And it's pretty common that we do this just because of the changing nature of the disease. And what we decide to do really depends on those specifics of what you're going through on a day-to-day basis. So like Ali mentioned earlier, if you're in a gray zone between the off and on, maybe your on just isn't good enough. You have a little bit of tremor improvement, but it's not all the way gone, or it's still limiting you, but you're not having wearing off fully in between doses. Just increasing the dose there probably makes the most sense, trying to improve the magnitude of the effect. If it's the other end, then maybe, my dose feels too high. I take it and then I have side effects. Then maybe we're talking about lowering doses, or maybe adding other things in to compensate for that. Or if it's wearing off in between doses, then we have a lot of different options actually to try to prolong the duration of each pill, or even switching to other formulations of the carbidopa-levodopa, like extended release. So it really is pretty individual, but I would say bottom line is really, if you don't think you're doing well, or if there are symptoms that are not well controlled enough, it's time to start talking about adjustments.
Now you mentioned a key word here, side effects. what are some of the more notable side effects that people should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so common ones with carbidopa, levodopa specifically, one of the most common, particularly when we first start it, is nausea or upset stomach. Sometimes can cause some sleepiness too. That's probably a little bit less common. Some of the side effects, though, that people tend to worry about, especially when we're talking about the longer term course of the disease, and when you're thinking in future years, are things like dyskinesia. So these are extra involuntary movements. So I think about what Parkinson's disease does to you is it slows your body down generally, move slower, smaller. The medicine helps you move better, quicker, faster. And if you overshoot that, then you're moving too much or can't control your movements. So kind of think about it on that spectrum. So that is a side effect. Generally, that is less common earlier in the course of the disease, but becomes more likely as the disease progresses. Other things might be blood pressure changes or a tendency for the blood pressure to drop or get low, or when you stand up, that the blood pressure drops and you get lightheaded or dizzy. And then another one to think about are hallucinations. So hallucinations are from Parkinson's disease itself. They are more likely to occur, again, as the disease progresses. Unfortunately, though, the medicines that we use to treat the motor symptoms, like levodopa and other drugs, can actually make that worse rather than better. So those are kind of the most common side effects that we think about.
Now, as we talk about these side effects, we mentioned earlier in this webinar that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, just approved a new drug. It's called Crexent, or Crexent, I believe is how it's pronounced. I want to talk about that because Brian, if you can tell us a little bit more about that, because it's just newly released information. What makes it different than what's currently available, and whether or not if it's different in your eyes in terms of by comparison with these side effects as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is a new drug. A company, Amneal, has been working on essentially a new formulation of the sort of standard levodopa, carbidopa that many people take. What they've done, what sort of, it's called Crexont, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing correctly. I could keep calling it IPX203 because that's the thing I was monitoring for the last couple of years around the drug. But what it essentially is doing, it's a sort of a new formulation. It's taking essentially an immediate release version and an extended release version of these drugs and kind of combining them together, really with this idea. And this is, I think, a common theme we're seeing with some of these newly optimized versions of the dopamine medications, which is, can we deliver these treatments more smoothly, sort of consistently over the course of the day to, one, reduce the number of pills you have to take over the course of the day, and two, reduce also maybe some of the ups and down valleys that often when you take a drug, just the kinetics of it in your body go up and then down and up and down. And we think that may lead to some of the side effects that people see. So we can kind of smooth it out. Hopefully, maybe you have to take less of it over the course of the day or less frequently over the course of the day and get, again, that good on time we talked about before, less of the off time, but also good on time that doesn't have maybe some of the other complications that come with it. So this is, one of a few examples that are in the pipeline right now. This is the one that's been most recently approved that are, again, trying to get at that question of how do we continue to extend the benefits of something as powerful as levodopa, as the disease progresses.
Thank you. No doubt that Dr. Jacobiak, you're going to get a ton of questions about this in the upcoming visits. With that, I want to move on and talk about how do we find our best regimen for us individually. Now, for me, I've been taking medication for more than 20 years now, and the biggest takeaway that I have is from a log that I started keeping since 2010. Now, 2010 to now, it's about 14 years. I started keeping a log about how I'm feeling when I'm on medication, what I'm eating when I'm taking certain medications, and what activity that I'm doing. And I've provided this data to my movement disorder specialist, and together we've come up with this data. Together we can see my peaks and valleys that you're talking about. And my goal is always to try to flatten those peaks and valleys as much as possible. So, and what I found for me personally is that it's lifestyle factors that are just as important for medication, and than just taking the pills alone itself, because exercise and what I'm eating can definitely change the way in terms of how my body metabolizes synthetic dopamine, right? So real quickly, Dr. Jacobiak, with talking, with you working with your patients, can you talk about how various lifestyles can come into play?
Yeah, that's perfect. And so, kind of what I was alluding to earlier, just asking people, what are you going through on a day-to-day basis? What are you experiencing? That type of information that you said you're keeping track of in a log, that's exactly what I want to hear. I want to hear, what do you want to be doing day to day? What are you doing well? What are you not doing well? Is that certain times of the day that you can do that? That information allows us to be able to tweak your medications better to really optimize the treatment regimen. So without that information as to what you're actually going through, it's very hard to know what to do with the medication. So that's essential. It's just really kind of understanding your life and your day, and what's important to you and what you want to be doing.
Yeah, and I want to bring that up. It's for me, it's not an easy task to be tracking all of this stuff all the time, right? But if you have that data, essentially what I'm doing is I'm able to provide that information so that I can get the most efficient use out of my medication. I started adding. I know, for example, if I'm running, when I'm training for a marathon and I'm running for hours at a time, I need to add a half a dose of carbidopa levodopa every 60 minutes versus the standard once every 3 hours, right? And I just wanted to give the audience that example, is that maybe it's not, I'm not saying this is for everybody, but that change in itself helped me train better, make my body stronger, and made my use of the medication in my system more effective. So, Ali, I wanted to ask, in your couple of years since your official diagnosis, what have you found in terms of lifestyle that's affected your own personal journey?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that Dr. Google will tell you about Parkinson's is that there's, all types of information and research about, maybe not research, but information about exercise and the benefits of it. Something I knew because I had worked in the Alzheimer's and brain health space prior to being diagnosed. I definitely feel better, more symptom-free when I'm working out regularly. Unlike you, find it very well. Maybe you find it difficult too, but I find it difficult to work out every day. When I'm on the workout wagon, I'm very much in it. I've run, marathons too. When I fall off the wagon, I fall off it hard. It's hard for me to mentally get back into the game. And I know that consistency is really key. So there's no question that it makes my symptoms better, my lifestyle feel better, my overall experience of life feel better. I struggle with consistency on it, and I think a lot of people do. So it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, and it's a lot mental, just like you said, right? A lot of this is mental. We deal with, and actually, just real quickly, I'm gonna, since we're talking about, I think the mental health aspect of it is also very important to keep in mind. That apathy does come with Parkinson's, right? Earlier on in my own diagnosis, my wife tells people now that she didn't know, what was wrong with me and why was I being so apprehensive about everything. So, Dr. Jacobiak, what are your quick thoughts about, like the mental side of living with the disease and medication? Like, what are some medication that might help with some of the mental aspects of living with Parkinson's?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think the answer for this will be a little bit different for everybody, actually. So we know that things like just depressed mood or anxiety, or apathy, like you said, or poor sleep. These are a number of things that can come along with the disease. Sometimes they're very much tied to physical symptoms, or sometimes very much tied to the kind of ups and downs throughout the day. And so when that's the case, we try to optimize the treatment of those physical symptoms. But unfortunately, the dopamine medications or the medicines we use to treat the motor symptoms commonly are not enough to treat the mental side of things. So that's where, finding an approach to treat those side, I think exercise, diet, just think, this is not necessarily Parkinson's specific, but just think about other things that can, help improve your mental health. Sometimes that's having a therapist or a psychologist. And sometimes that does actually require using medications to treat mood or anxiety too. So that will be a little bit different for everybody. But it is an important thing to keep in mind when we think about the treatment of Parkinson's and about the, treating your whole person, your whole life. It's not all just physical symptoms.
And one of the things that I found very helpful is that when I go and during my visits with my movement disorder specialist is to have, a list of questions, written down, right? And that can include mood. And now I usually go to my movement disorder specialist. And I think it's when people see their movement disorder, I think it's a good idea to have somebody go with them. And having somebody going in, I think can provide the movement disorder specialist with additional insights into how a person is feeling. So I think, bringing somebody in, because I always go in and especially initially, I always want to tell everybody, look how well I'm doing, right? Or tell my movement, look how well I'm doing. But then, there's always the other side. Your care partner might look at you and says, you're not doing that well because you're not talking about X, Y, and Z. And I wanted to bring that up because Dr. Jacoby, I think, what do you think? Do you think that's very helpful? Do you think that a perspective from a care partner in your appointments can help you with medicine changes and prescriptions, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the very reasons you stated, your experience is your experience. That's obviously important. But your care partner, who spends a lot of time with you, oftentimes notices things that you don't, or will, be more willing to bring those up in appointment if it's something that you don't necessarily want to talk about, even though it's important to talk about. So that's great. The other thing I'll say, it's very, very common, when you examine a patient, I'm looking at your motor function, I go out in the hall and I watch you walk, very, very frequently, the care partner will say, they're walking so much better than what they do at home. They're showing off for you, right? So, just having that other bit of insight to see, another set of eyes as to what's actually going on at home is helpful.
Yeah, no, yeah, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say the other piece of it, I think, is establishing a really good relationship and communication strategy with your MDS outside of your appointments. Because for me, I meet with mine maybe every 6 months in person, but having the ability to connect with him in the patient portal when major things come up or major changes occur, I think is also really important, because some of it you really can't wait, for your yearly exam to communicate major changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a hard time imagining Jimmy just walking down a hall versus, I don't know, doing some sort of elaborate climbing, swinging approach to it.
One of the things that I do when I do see my movement disorder specialist is I do try to go in a near off state. I at the end of the day, I have to be honest with myself as to my progression. And I think when you come in at a near off state, it shows a lot about where I am. And I can always come back and make comparisons from visit to visit, because I know that I'm not always going in at my best, right? So thanks for that, Brian. I appreciate the confidence you have in my ability to move. Now, I want to move on to our next discussion topic, which is, we talked about right now. We talked about what's available today and how do we deal with what's available today. We're getting a ton of questions about, that's great, but what's next? What's coming down the pipeline? What's on the horizon? Brian, can you give us an overview of what that pipeline is?
Sure. So maybe just quick defining when we talk about pipeline for our purposes, really what we're talking about is sort of the whole body of therapies that are being developed and tested for disease like Parkinson's. So we think of the therapeutic pipeline as really being this sort of staged set of studies from kind of early what we call preclinical studies, where the drug makers are trying to figure out what type of drug to make and whether it in the laboratory has some effects, all the way to the sort of clinical trial pipeline, which is testing in it or initially in people, an early clinical pipeline for safety, and then sort of progressively testing it for efficacy, and then ultimately kind of in the what we call the big phase 3 study. Does it really seem to have benefit in a safe way? And then that's the data you can use to go to regulators to get approval for use in a disease like Parkinson's. So that's kind of when we talk about pipeline, that's what we're talking about. But so we spend a lot of time at the foundation, obviously, looking at the pipeline. If anything, the best, in our view, best barometer for kind of seeing progress in Parkinson's disease is, what's happening in the pipeline. And I can say today that we are super jazzed and excited about all the great ideas that are currently going through the testing process in the pipeline. And, I tend to sort of group things, and you can kind of see, I think here on the slides, some quantification, attempted quantification of what the pipeline looks like. I think what's exciting to see is that there's a lot of work focused on, sort of progression. And when we talk about progression, we're talking about treatments that we think can maybe slow the disease process down, sort of slow the progression of the disease, and hopefully delay the onset of some of the later aspects of Parkinson's disease. So there's a lot of great work that is really targeting different types of biology, different types of mechanisms that we think might potentially slow the disease down. There's still, this is what we want to see this, still a fair amount of work that's trying to address specific symptoms of the disease. So these often are treatments that aren't necessarily specifically trying to slow the disease down so much as reduce the impact of the symptoms or kind of restore function in different ways. And there's a whole, again, range of different treatments. We obviously just talked about one, the newer treatments that was approved with the drug that we talked about earlier, the new formulation of levodopa. There are other versions, kind of a dopamine medication tweaks that are coming close to possible FDA approval, we think, in the coming months. And then a whole range and host of other treatments that are targeting, again, different brain mechanisms that we think might underlie some of the symptoms, both the motor symptoms, again, the movement symptoms, but also some of these non-motor symptoms that we've been talking about as well, some of the less sort of reported, less often talked about symptoms of Parkinson's disease, thinking problems and, constipation and sleep issues and things like that. Jimmy, you mentioned apathy. That's a really important, I think, under-addressed need of when we've talked to members of our patient council, for example. They've really raised apathy as a real issue. So there are some efforts to look at treatments for apathy in the pipeline. We gave a grant to a company, Erlab, late last year to kind of explore a drug they have that they think might have some benefits in apathy. So we're starting to see, again, a combination of real diverse ideas in that therapeutic pipeline. And again, for us, that's really exciting to see, because that's really where we think the future hope lies for Parkinson's disease.
No, that great. Thank you for that. And you mentioned, some of the therapies in the pipeline are targeting ways to slow progression of certain symptoms and parts of the disease. And you mentioned that that could be more of along the sides of a possible disease modification. Can we talk about a little bit more of that? Like what's ahead for us? Like what's in the pipeline that is classified as disease modification?
Yeah. This is, it's sort of a mix of a lot of different ideas. A lot of this, I would say, our sort of knowledge of the biology that we think underlies Parkinson's disease a lot of that comes actually from our studies of the genetics of Parkinson's. And so we don't really think of Parkinson's as a predominantly genetic disease. Certainly there are other diseases out there that are driven predominantly by gene mutations and things like that. Those tend to be rare diseases, to be honest. But when we do find cases of sort of genetic Parkinson's disease, what that often gives us is sort of a flag in the ground, if you will, around the biology that tells us, okay, this is a biological process, because genes are basically the instructions in cells that help the cell make protein. And it's really proteins that are doing a lot of the work in the cell. And so if we can link a gene to a protein and its alteration in disease like Parkinson's, that gives us something to understand better about the disease, and we can take that forward. So, so we are excited to see a lot of ideas in the pipeline that are focused on these kind of gene biology defined approaches. You may hear us talk about a protein called alpha-synuclein, for example. You may hear us talk about another protein called LRRK2. They all have these funny names that scientists like to give them. Protein called GBA. There are all these different proteins that are being sort of targeted in the therapeutic pipeline. Now, whether they're going to benefit everybody with Parkinson's or subsets of people with Parkinson's, I think these are big open questions. And so again, you often these trials, again, will be very potentially sometimes selective about different groups of people. Maybe sometimes they only want people who have the genetic mutation. Other times they're looking for other kinds of biology, perhaps, that might be relevant for these drugs. And so we're seeing, again, just a lot of these ideas being tested. And I think, I'll end with this. I think one of the things we're also really seeing and kind of learning through all this process is, and this is a little bit about some of the tools we have now available, including people have maybe heard about the biomarker effort last year. We're starting to be able to kind of select people a little bit based more on their biology to better match with the type of therapy that's being tested in the pipeline. And I think that's a really powerful marriage of two sort of converging research efforts, both our ability to measure the disease sort of biology and our ability to deliver drugs that are more precisely targeted at that biology. And that, for me, is the exciting future that we're seeing in the pipeline.
Yeah, and it's exciting for me too. I mean, I've been around the block here for quite a while, and what's most hopeful for me is that 15 years ago, the pipeline looked vastly different. There were almost no treatment in the therapies in the pipeline, so to speak, that was targeting disease modification. And today we have, more, I would say more than a handful. So that to me is very hopeful. Ali, before we get to the Q&A, how about you? When you hear that information, what's hopeful for you for the future?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to it all and seeing the pipeline is heartening. When you are first diagnosed and you hear that levodopa was founded in the 70s and it's the gold standard still to this day, it's disheartening. You think, even with the agonists and other drugs that have come forward, we're still talking about basically the same main option and nothing to slow progression medically or, in terms of medication. So all of it's exciting. I'm super grateful to the foundation for leading it. I know that they have done the lion's share of it. Hopefully the government will catch up in terms of funding it. So all guns a-blazing at this point, hopefully.
Well, thank you for that. So we've gotten a lot of questions in so far, and I just wanted to make sure we start getting to some of these questions. I'm going to jump right in. Just a quickly reminder for everybody else, if you still have any questions, please keep sending them in, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Now, the first question that we seem to be getting a ton of is, and this is going to be for Dr. Jacobiak, is what's the difference between this new drug Crescent and Rytary?
Yeah, so both medications are extended release capsules of carbidopa levodopa, and it's important to compare those to another form of, usually it says like CR, controlled release carbidopa levodopa, or SA. There's different types, or ER. The difference between these are they're actually capsules that have within them a mixture of short-acting carbidopa levodopa, longer-acting carbidopa levodopa, and the way that the capsule is constructed helps that kind of more evenly be absorbed and have the duration of the effect last longer. So it's a better, true extended release compared to the other. Both of them are. Just the individual makeup of that capsule and the ratio of immediate to extended release are slightly different.
And then just to clarify, the new drug for our audience is CREXONT. That is the spelling for it. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Jacobiak. Now, next question is, what foods should we be taking with our medication? More specifically, not just around the nausea, but proteins.
Yeah, the important idea here is that protein can interfere with the way that carbidopa levodopa is absorbed. So if you are taking your medications around the same time that you are eating protein, that you will get less effect generally, or less of that medication absorbed into your system. Really important to remember, though, that doesn't mean you can't eat protein at all in your diet. That's important. It's just the timing of this. And so I usually say, you know, ideal world, take your medications an hour before or 2 hours after you eat. I know that's difficult, particularly if you're taking multiple doses throughout the day. So I try to say at minimum 30 minutes before, 60 minutes after you eat. But protein is really the most important, or the you know, what actually interferes the most.
Yeah, I'm a gym rat, so you know, I need a lot of protein to keep my systems going, and I do exactly what you say. I take my protein plus or minus an hour before when I actually take my medication, and then I also do a lot of heavy loading protein towards the end of the day versus in the beginning of my day. So thank you. All right, next question is for Allie. Allie, how do you keep track of your medications?
Oh, good question. I take a lot of medications, not just for this, but for some other health issues. So I put a note in my phone, like on my calendar, a reminder to an alarm to remind me to take them. There's also, I also separate them out into a pill box so that I can see when I have or haven't taken them during the day. There's also some great apps out there. There's one specific to Parkinson's called My Moves Matter, which you can use to track when you've taken them. It's very simple and very effective. I will admit that I'm not great at remembering to plug that in, but there's lots of different technologies that you can use. And then I still forget. So my husband is great about reminding me. I carry around a little box of pills for when I'm not at home. Just do the best you can. Try not to forget.
Try not to forget. Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions on freezing of gait, and you know, what can help that. So I'm going to turn that one over to Dr. Jacobiak as well, and maybe Brian as well for that one. But we'll start with Dr. Jacobiak.
Yeah, so freezing is kind of when, think about when you're walking and the feet kind of get stuck, or you do the quick shuffle steps, or that you can't, you know, get started walking. So that's freezing. Sometimes this occurs just when the medicines are wearing off, or kind of in that off phase. But unfortunately, even when the medicines are on and working, this can occur. And the medicines we have, like carbidopa, levodopa, are oftentimes ineffective. And there's, you know, to be honest, not a lot out there that is guaranteed to work for this from a medication perspective. So commonly what we do are actually, you know, more behavioral techniques. So ways to kind of trick your mind or trick your feet into picking up and moving. So, you know, there's, you know, like laser lights, you're giving yourself an obstacle to step over can help. Marching in place. Usually I refer to physical therapy to kind of work on these and practice these. But I'll turn it over to Brian about some maybe, you know, things that could help in the future.
Yeah, this is such a, I mean, you know, and certainly for people living with Parkinson's, you know, if you're having gait issues or these freezing of gait problems, or, you know, falls can often be a sort of a consequence of some of this. You know, it becomes a really, you know, I think a powerful, impactful sort of challenge for the disease. It's, you know, interesting from a research perspective, you know, community has really tried to understand, again, what is underlying sort of the gait problems and freezing of gait. And there's sort of a lot of, you know, neuroscience and brain circuitry, you know, cracking and understanding to try to you know, figure that out better. We think maybe some aspects of this could be linked to cognitive sort of thinking problems. The two can kind of go hand in hand, as you sort of have to sort of switch your thinking when you're turning around, say, or walking through a door, your brain is doing a lot of processing. And whenever those things happen, most of us, we don't seem to think about it. It's sort of involuntary, but for someone with Parkinson's, some of those circuits might be a little bit sort of off balance and can make, freezing of gait happen. So there's a lot of interest in trying to target that from a research perspective. I think, as Eric was saying, there's not a lot of great treatment options outside of, some of the things he mentioned. It's interesting that gait is an area where we're seeing a lot of people attempt to apply technology, sort of assistive technologies, to try to address. So Eric mentioned some of the cueing approaches. We've seen people use auditory cueing or visual cueing, with a laser line, things like that, trying to trick your brain into like, okay, let's step over that line, or sort of use some sort of rhythmic cueing to try to help address some of the gait issues. But it's a really complicated sort of symptom, I think, largely because it's such a complicated brain circuit that there could be a lot of things that could be going on there. So it's made it really a little bit challenging for us to figure out. But it's definitely an area that we're seeing a lot of research happening. We actually had a program sort of funded over the last 6 months or so, specifically targeting gait and balance for issues for Parkinson's disease, both looking at it from kind of a understanding measurement challenge, how can we better measure these things so we can predict, the people who might have the problem later on, as well as how do we sort of think about the treatment side. So there's definitely a lot of work and attention happening on it right now.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, definitely it is a very touchy and very important subject, because it's often one of the most debilitating things that happen when it comes to freezing in the middle of doing something, especially for your safety. This hour has flown past, and we've still got a lot of questions that are coming in. We're going to make our best efforts to answer a lot of these questions offline for you guys. But we're out of time today, unfortunately. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of the community and for joining us today. Thank you once again, panelists, for your time and your expertise. We're going to be sending a link to the webinar on demand to watch again and share if you like. We hope that you find today's discussion helpful, or at least the start of a conversation that you can bring to your movement disorder specialist. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day. Take care.